video here, and today I'm going to be coming at you with my November wrap-up. So as always, my wrap-ups are a combination of a wrap-up and a book haul. So at the end of this video I will also be going into the books that I acquired in the month of November, letting you know whether I ended up reading more than I bought or whether I bought more than I should have. But so let's just dive into the video without any further ado. This is a month in which I didn't read too many books in terms of like the amount of books, but in terms of pages it is one of the better months of the year, and I kind of had to like balance like short reads with longer reads. There are some extremely short ones on here, but also some extremely long ones. So let's just start with it. So the first one is Hard Times by Charles Dickens, which is a reread, which is also a common theme throughout this month because I did reread about 4 books I think this month. So Hard Times by Charles Dickens is the first Dickens that I read. I read it at university, and it's not one of the books that really made me, that really turned me into Charles Dickens lover. At this point in time I really want to read all of Charles Dickens' works, but when I read this one, that definitely wasn't my opinion. I think I gave it a 3-star rating, and my main takeaway from this was that it was quite boring. However, having returned to it now after having read so much of Charles Dickens, it is actually a perfect combination of that writing style that I love so much and a concise and, well plotted storyline, because this one is a lot shorter than a lot of his other works, and he definitely did plot this one out intentionally. A lot of the other Charles Dickens that I read are like extremely long. He was paid by the letter, and a lot of the times he would also like change his narrative depending on what he was hearing in the streets, because his novels were being produced, were being published week by week, and so he did get to hear the public's response to what he was putting in his books, and so that did change the way that the narrative was going, which I feel can sometimes result in his stories being a little bit too, circular or a little bit too chaotic. And so with this one I feel like it's such a perfect combination of his writing style with a concise and well-flowed and well-plotted book. It is a book in which, I would say the main thematic of this one is looking at the sort of idea that facts and knowledge are the sort of holy goal that we should all be reaching for. The idea of education being all about learning the hard facts and about studying facts and being able to reproduce factual knowledge, versus the sort of idea that we might also need something like emotion, like sentiments, like fantasy. So within this book we are starting off with the character of Thomas Gradgrind, who is a school teacher who is all about facts, and so he also really impels his children to think that way. So his children really cannot be dreamy or cannot be fanciful, because then he'll be like, no, this is not how I brought you up. You need to be thinking facts only. Facts are the ideal of life. And so we'll be following the children of Thomas Gradgrind and seeing how this has an impact on their life. Their education is then kind of contrasted with the character of Sissy, who is a young girl who grew up in a sort of circus environment. And Sissy is very much a girl who doesn't really have that sort of factual base, that factual knowledge, and she kind of then becomes a sort of project for Thomas Gradgrind. But I won't go into more in this book, but I definitely think that it is one of his most well-balanced books. It does still have its moments where it seems to be going off on a sort of sidetrack that you don't really know why it's there, and I wouldn't say that some of those sidetracks are really necessary all the time, but I definitely do think it's one of his most well-balanced story in terms of length and writing style. It's possibly one of my favorite Dickens at this point. So if you're looking for a way into Charles Dickens, then this I definitely think is a good one, as well as of course A Christmas Carol, which is also one of his short works that is very well plotted. So those two I would definitely recommend as a way into Charles Dickens. Next up, let's talk about one of the shorter reads that I had this month, and that is Desire by Haruki Murakami. So this is part of a collection by Vintage, the Vintage Minis, which are collections of short stories surrounded around a central thematic. In this case it is desire, and by different authors. So this is the Desire edition with the author Haruki Murakami. Now I will say this is my first foray into Haruki Murakami's short storytelling, and I do definitely think that I prefer his full-length novels, because while it did definitely have that same atmosphere, and so it immediately brought me back into that that sort of like feeling you get when you're reading a Haruki Murakami novel. It also left me wanting so much more every single time, and I definitely didn't think that, you know, his sort of like weird style in a short story, there's just too little time for him to explore that sort of weird vibe or that weird flow that he's taking his stories to. As with a lot of Haruki Murakami's, I will also say that, you know, I did feel like we were once again creating like sort of these mysterious, enigmatic female characters that we never hear from, because usually Murakami will almost always write from a male perspective. And so in this one as well, there was this short story where I found myself to be so much drawn into the female character, really wondering, you know, what the motivations behind her actions, behind her decisions were. And we never really go into that, you know, that always stays a mystery and an enigma, and we were always kind of dealing with the way in which the male character reacts to the female characters, the way that that makes him feel. And I would just really want to see some of these, you know, I would really just want to see the other side of that type of story once in a while from Murakami. But so I think it's a nice one to give you a sort of like sense of his writing style, and to maybe see if this is an atmosphere that grabs you or not, if you like the sort of directions in which his stories are going. But in terms of really being able to decide on Haruki Murakami based on just a short story in this collection, I would definitely say give one of his full-length works a go, rather than just fully rely on something like a short story by him. Next we get into the bulk of my reading, because I definitely read more than a few pages by this author this month, and that would be Brandon Sanderson. So first off, I reread Edgedancer by Brandon Sanderson, which is a novella taking place between books 2 and 3 in the Stormlight Archive. So Stormlight Archive is this sort of like epic fantasy project that is going to span 10 books. All of the books are over 1,200 pages. This was the first novella in the series. We have a second one already. I think the third one has just been announced. So we'll not just be getting these 10 books, we'll also be getting some novellas here and there, because as these books are massive, but still he spends a whole lot of time in character development within this series, meaning that even though the books can be 1,200 pages, there is still the possibility for him to not be able to explore certain characters to the extent that he wants to. So we'll often get these sort of like side novellas in which he gets to delve into side quests that some of these characters go on, but also into the character development of some of these maybe lesser important characters to the whole of the Cosmere, but still very interesting ones to follow, but still very interesting ones for the fans to be able to dive into a little bit more. So in this one we are actually diving further into Lift, which is a character that we only were introduced to in one of the interludes within Words of Radiance or Way of Kings, I think Words of Radiance. And she is a very interesting character. She is a girl who will play a very big role within the rest of the Stormlight Archive. So I actually definitely recommend that you try this novella out to get a closer view of Lift, because indeed she doesn't get a whole lot of screen time necessarily all the time, but she does play a central role within the Cosmere and will probably play a bigger role within Stormlight Archive in the future as well. And so I definitely highly recommend this one. I shouldn't really have reread it, because I thought like, yeah, if I'm gonna reread Oatbringer, I also want to reread Edgedancer, because I thought I hadn't reread it when I reread Words of Radiance, but I actually did. So this is the second reread I did for this book. I don't fully regret it, because I absolutely love this book. But if I hadn't reread it, maybe I could have fit in Dawnshard into this month as well. But yeah, I mean, I'm still happy I reread it. Apart from Edgedancer, I also reread Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson. So this is book 3 within the Stormlight Archive. It is my least favorite entry into the series, and I will still say that that is still my opinion, but that is also mainly just due because I don't particularly like the character of Dalinar all that much. And you know, I did definitely enjoy his storyline within this book, and I definitely do respect the character work that was done here. And there are some beautiful passages based around the character of Dalinar within this one, but still, because he is not my favorite character and my favorite character also gets the least amount of attention within this one, I do definitely think it is my least favorite one. There is also a big portion of this book that definitely dragged a whole lot for me, so in that sense it was also, I took longer with this reread than I expected, because I was kind of hoping that my reread for this one would be so much quicker as it had been for Words of Radiance. But you know, for this one I definitely had that whole section where I had to kind of drag my feet to go through it and really have to be like, you know, if I want to be reading Rhythm of War when it comes out, I need to make a headway through this book. So I definitely did need to like discipline myself a little bit more with this one than I would with Words of Radiance, which I always fly through when I'm reading it. So for me, my least favorite entry into the series, but for some other people it's actually their favorite one. So, you know, opinions definitely differ on this one. And then all of that, of course, was leading up to Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. So this was published on the 17th of this month, and I, along with a whole lot of Brandon Sanderson's fans, have been reading it immediately after it came out. So it is the 4th installment. In principle, chronologically, you should be reading Dawnshard before you read this one, but I couldn't wait. And I will say that, like, yes, there are indications of what has happened in Dawnshard throughout this book, but it's really just very vague hints that you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, but since I know the premise of Dawnshard, I assume that it's mentioned in Dawnshard. So I wouldn't necessarily say you need to read Dawnshard before you go into this one. And I would say I definitely highly enjoyed this one. It's not my favorite yet, I think. I would say that it's probably like second favorite next to Words of Radiance. It is very much focused on Navani and Kaladin, for example, in terms of perspectives. And it's definitely one that changes my opinion about Navani. I didn't really have an opinion about Navani, but I absolutely fell in love with her through this book. And in this one we're also going to go deeper into the Parshendi backstory, though I will say that I found that to be a little bit of a weaker part. I feel like the flashback sequences within this book didn't really work, and while it's supposed to be Venli and Eshonai's book, it definitely felt more like Navani's book than it felt like theirs. And what I also definitely love is all of the Cosmere connections that exist within this book. This is definitely one that's making me very excited to reread a lot of the Cosmere in 2021, for example. But so yeah. Definitely think that it's a great one. I think mostly I've been seeing a lot of positive reviews for this one. I think the main thing that people aren't liking about this one is Parshendi. But for me, as I was saying, it's really just those flashback sequences. In the present day sequences, I definitely did like the Parshendi perspectives a lot. It was really just those flashbacks for me personally. Next up, let's talk about another short one, and that is No One is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg. So Greta Thunberg is a climate change activist. She is a Swedish girl of 17 years of age at this point. But so she is the sort of like organizer of school strikes. She's the one who started it all and has brought so much awareness to the issue surrounding climate change. And I will say that I absolutely respect her as a person, and she has done so much. And for somebody that young, she's definitely a very influential person. But as a collection, this doesn't really work all that well, because this is a collection of all her speeches, and most of her speeches share the same elements, contain the same information, but just structured in a different way, for example. So if you read this the whole way through in one go, as I more or less did, then it's very circular and you're going to be reading the same thing over and over again. So I would definitely say, if you have this collection, for example, to just like read a few every once in a while, and then that will work a lot better than if you read them all at the same time. You're like just rereading the same elements over and over and over again, which means that it's very fresh in my mind at this point, but it is of course not necessarily the greatest reading experience in that case. And then the final book of the month, which in principle I didn't finish yet, but I still have a few hours in the day. I still have some, like, I don't know, what is it, 4 o'clock at this point? I still have some time today, and I am planning to still finish it, and that will be The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I'm reading for Tolkien along. So this is a read-along hosted by Ashley from A Frolic to Friction and Beth from Book's Nest. And so in this one they are rereading they are reading The Lord of the Rings in 3 months, like spread over 3 months. So next month we will also be reading The Return of the King. The Two Towers, as far as I remembered, was the worst entry into this series, because we are basically splitting POV. So first half of The Two Towers we are following the rest of the Fellowship, and the second half of this book we are following Frodo, Sam and Gollum. And so I still feel like that splits, like it works better in the movie, where we're getting like a change between the two perspectives, especially because, you know, while we in the rest of the Fellowship we're still like switching between the Merry Pippin storyline and then the Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli storyline. Frodo and Sam bit is just a whole lot of time spent with Frodo, Sam and Gollum, and there's no like diversion there, and so they are also just like traveling for a very long time. I think it's a great reflection of the fact that it is a gruesome, dreary, depressing journey. You definitely start to feel that through its length, but it isn't the most entertaining of reads in that sense. But I have been flying through this a lot quicker than I did on first read. I definitely think that The Lord of the Rings is a great one to read as an audiobook. For me it works a lot better when I'm listening to it than when I'm actually reading the words, because it does have the tendency sometimes to drone on a little bit, which I can apparently deal with a lot better when it's read to me than when I actually have to read the words. And I have definitely been loving seeing a sort of criticism on industrialization. Definitely already knew before that that is a huge thematic within The Lord of the Rings. But in this one it definitely also caught my attention. At some point he's really talking about Mordor as this land that has been exhausted, that has been worked to its fullest by man, that is now totally exhausted because man has taken every single piece of fertile land on that earth. And so that is definitely something that I now think, like, in comparison with No One Is, like, if I now think of like No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg, I think like Tolkien would have been horrified if he was living at this point in time, and if he was seeing the fact, and if he was really seeing like how far we've gone with that industrialization, how close we are to really destroying the earth, as he was like already commenting on within this work. But so yeah, I've definitely been enjoying this a lot more than I did the first time around. As with my previous reread for the Fellowship of the Rings, I will say that I respect this book. I do like this book a whole lot, but it's never going to be my favorite fantasy. It did a whole lot for the genre, and it definitely deserves its dues for that. But I do definitely think that it isn't, you know, it's not blasphemy to say that there are better fantasy works out there at this point in time. In terms of storytelling, this isn't that compelling. This is a lot of a world-building book more than it is a sort of like plot-centered book or a sort of character-centered book, which I definitely am a character-centered reader. And so character development within this book, we don't really dive into the characters' motivations, the characters' changes and things like that all that much within this book, for example. So that's basically it for the wrap-up section of this month's wrap-up. So in terms of unread physical books, I read 3 books this month, so I was able to reduce it by 3. But I also bought some books, of course. So not all of these books actually end up adding to my physical TBR, but some of them do. So first of all, let me just talk about the 2 books that I also read this month, and that is then Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson and No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg. And then I also acquired some other books. First of all, I bought Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This does not add to my physical TBR because I've previously read it. I am going to be rereading this one in 2021, so I wanted a physical copy this time around so that I can also do some annotations. This is basically the first book that Brandon Sanderson ever published. A lot of people therefore also seem to consider it his weakest. I didn't really focus on any sort of like critical reading when I first went through this book, so I couldn't really speak to it being all that weak when I first read it, but so I definitely will be interested to dive into it again and look for those connections. You know, I already saw a connection in Rhythm of War that was very blatant, but you know, who knows, maybe there are some more connections here. But so Elantris is about the city of Elantris, which used to be this very important metropolis that had these sort of like godlike beings that were revered by all. But then there was this sort of illness that took place that really decimated this population, and so now this basically is a quarantine zone, and a new capital is kind of built around the city of Elantris. And at the very beginning of the story, the sort of illness that's led to the destruction of Elantris has taken the crown prince of this kingdom, and he is exiled into Elantris. We are following more perspectives than just his. We are, for example, also following Serene, who had been engaged to marry this crown prince and who is actually on her way to the capital and will there be involved in some sort of like political turmoil. We're following a sort of priest who's trying to convert people to a new religion, and you know, I thought it was quite interesting and it delved into some interesting topics, so I want to kind of reread it now, having read even more Sanderson in the meantime, see whether There are indeed some things that I don't like about this one, for example. Another one that's not adding to my TBR is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, which I already read in October, I think, maybe even September. So I had an arc for this one. This is the newest book by Sayaka Murata, who also published Convenience Store Woman. Had a very interesting experience with this one, so I recommend that you check it out in this video. But so this is a book that I hated for the first third of it, and then I fell in love with it for the later half of this. But this has very disturbing content. It's definitely one that has all the trigger warnings more or less that is possible. But so at the very beginning we kind of see how our protagonist is somebody who is kind of escaping through fantasy. She is being abused by family, she is being sexually abused by a teacher of hers, and so she kind of escapes into the fantasy idea that she is an alien who has been left on Earth, and that maybe one day the aliens will come back to come and save her from her family, for example. So it dives into some very gruesome, very graphic depictions of those dark subject matters within the first third of the novel. And it's not like the later half of the book isn't as dark, but then we move out of this child perspective and we move to our protagonist, and we get to our protagonist being in her 20s, 30s, and she's very much somebody who's trying to escape the conventions of society, the idea that she needs to marry, have kids, settle down. So very much love this one in the end, even though I was very close to DNFing this one. Final one that I got that isn't going to get added to my TBR is Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. So this is the illustrated edition, which it's very difficult for me to show because it is so heavy, but let me just get, like, this is the random page that I landed on. But so Northern Lights is a trilogy that I read in my teenage years, and I definitely want to reread at some point. And you know, I'm quite fuzzy on the subject matter. I know it went a lot into criticism on organized religion, for example, which is part of the books that probably went way over my head when I first read them. But basically we're following this young girl called Lyra, and in this world everybody has this sort of like demon who is kind of an animal representation of their sort of like spirit animal. And children, which I think the brilliant thing about this, I think, is that children's demon can kind of still shift forms, so they can still change from one animal into another depending on the mood of their of the child itself. And she kind of gets involved in this whole lot of adventures and in some political scheming and things like that, but I won't go into it too much because I also don't know too much anymore about the specifics of this story. And then the final book that I acquired this month is the third book that I added to my TBR this month. So I bought 3 books and I read 3 books, so we are at score 0 for this month. No improvement, but also no, you know, I didn't add more to the TBR than I read, so that's also a positive, I guess. And that's The Inland Sea by Madeleine. So this was part of the Books That Matter book box for this month, and so The Inland Sea is a book set in Australia, in which we're going to be looking at the grandchild of a British explorer who was looking for this sort of like mythical sea in the middle of Australia. And we're kind of following this story from the perspective of his great-great-great-granddaughter, who's very much somebody who's kind of spiraled. She's very much into drinking, drugs, she has an abusive relationship, it seems, a lot of self-destructive behavior. But I'm going to assume that we're going to be dipping into both stories and that they might meet at some point in time. I very much like stories that have to do with exploration, with diving into the unknown, so that aspect of it definitely draws me in, and so I'm hoping that I'm going to love this one. But so yeah, that was it for the month of November, and now it's time to dive into the final reading month of the year. I'm very much looking forward to rounding off this year, rounding off 2020. I think we're all looking forward to 2021, but I'll still first celebrate Christmas because that's my favorite day of the year. So let me know down below if there are any of these books that have sparked your interest or that you've read as well, and then we can talk about them further in the chat. But so yeah, see you guys for the next one. Bye!